The glass shattered against the night with a sound like a small truth giving way. Elena's hand punched the pane before she understood what she had done. Moonlight poured through the jagged mouth of her office window, illuminating a stranger perched on the ledge outside. Not quite human. His skin caught the light and folded it as if it were water, every movement sending a slow ripple along his forearm. He sat with his knees drawn to his chest like a griever, and when he lifted his head, his eyes were not cruel or hungry, but unbearably, pleadingly tired. "Elena Ruiz," he said in Spanish with an accent that smelled of brine, "you will come with me. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. She should have called the police. She should have slammed the window and locked the lab doors. And she could have explained afterward, explained the broken glass, the footprints in the dust, the flash of phosphorescent skin outside a fifth-floor apartment in Malasaña. Instead, she stepped onto the sill with the reckless curiosity that had gotten her tenure and cost her half a marriage. A scientist's private, essential sin. Up close, his skin was a living map of light, like oil on wet stone. And his voice, when he spoke again, carried a cadence that eased the sharp edges of panic. "My name is Kyle," he said. "I ask for a single night, Elena Ruiz. Wiltshire, the Stones." She should have laughed, and part of her did, a breathless little hysterical sound that escaped into the night. His face did not look like a joke. There was sorrow in the hollow of his cheek and a small alien scar that thinned the corner of an unhuman eye. She thought of her mother's voice in Merida, "Be sensible, keep your hands clean," and the phrase that had followed her entire career like a talisman, "Follow the evidence." Kale placed a hand on the sill, and where his fingers touched the concrete, a faint bioluminescence bloomed and then faded. "We were shepherds once," he said, as if reciting a half-remembered myth. "I can show you the truth behind your monuments." Elena had built her life around tracing the fingerprints of the impossible. As an archaeogeneticist, she threaded DNA through myths, winding, patient comparisons of teeth and pollen, the slow arithmetic of lineage. She'd spent nights hunched over sequencers in a lab that smelled of ethanol and coffee, coaxing meaning from dust. For 10 years she had been chasing an obsession, a repeating genetic pattern in bones found under stone circles and megaliths, a variant that suggested not only migration, but guidance, a human hand led by knowledge that seemed too directed to be purely terrestrial. Her colleagues called it the Wiltshire Cluster. She had called it her path to something larger. She had dreamed of a discovery that would make the world tilt. She had not dreamed it would tilt toward a being who could bend moonlight on his skin. She still had time to say no. Kale's invitation was a theft as plain as the broken glass. He had entered without permission, carried secrets without passport stamps, promised a revelation no peer-reviewed journal could sanction without a subpoena. But his hand brushed a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that rewired whatever defense she'd formed against loneliness. The labs in Madrid had been both sanctuary and cell. Elena could feel the ache that had hollowed her there, the distancing of colleagues when discussion turned from data to the big, dangerous words, contact, origin, treaty. Her life had been precise. Kale introduced a wild variable. She stepped down from the sill. The drive to Wiltshire made no practical sense. They flew as if no border or bureaucracy existed, over the Iberian coast, over the white cliffs of Dover. Kale beside her in the small passenger chair, his skin catching the cabin light like a living map of the sea. He spoke little. He watched her with the concentration of someone watching a plant learn to unbend toward a light. Elena cataloged him as a researcher would, physiology that shimmered beneath a human cadence, eyes that slept the way the sea sleeps at night, language patterns that carried the memory of tides. She thought of Thomas Hale only as a possibility, a bureaucratic phantom whose existence she half-invented to keep herself grounded. Eventually, she thought, someone would ask questions. For now, the night belonged to the stranger who had stood on her ledge and asked to be trusted. They arrived at Stonehenge in a silence so deep the car radio sounded obscene. The site was a silhouette of heavy grace under a round, incandescent moon, an old thing and a clear thing, bones set against the sky. Kale parked the car miles from the stones and led her on foot through dew-damp fields, his steps exact, measured, as if following a choreography older than his species. When they broke through the last flint fence and Stonehenge rose ahead, Elena felt the hush of recognition that happens when a theory aligns with sight. All the DNA markers she had pored over, all the patterning of construction across cultures, folded into a single, staggering possibility. He did not speak as he approached the circle. Instead, he sank to his knees before the Sarsens and placed his hands on the cool, cigar-smelling stone. The air around him shivered. A sound rose, thin and marine, and then the stone seemed to answer, an oscillation in stone that felt like an old, whispered name. Elena's breath left her as if someone had taken it in 2 fingers. She had studied the acoustics of megaliths, recorded standing waves in the way certain stone arrangements amplified particular frequencies, but nothing in her airless papers prepared her for the sensation of a living song threaded through rock.
As the minutes unfurled, Cale began to speak again, and this time his words came in fragments that were not human language, but that Elena understood with an intimacy that frightened her. They were images at first, a coastline where a small craft had run aground, a group of human hands in earth-dark sun, the transfer of seeds from one pair of palms to another. He laid his palm against a section of stone, and the rock beneath them hummed, releasing a thin, metallic scent. It was as if memory had been stored not in ink or bone, but in the very grain of the world. Elena's fingers tingled with her own synapses firing. They were being read, in a way. She felt strands of patterning twine through her mind, like threads pulled by a foreign weaver. "These constructions are not monuments to power," Cale said at last, his voice slow. "They are markers, points of covenant. We taught, you built. There was an agreement." Elena's scientist's brain wanted to test, to catalog, to take biopsies and run gel electrophoresis. Yet the first thing that presented itself to her was the sight of human hands in those images. Hands like her father's, hands like hers, accepting gifts with a mix of suspicion and hope. She had, in the cool fluorescent light of many labs, called certain sequences anomalies. Here, under the hush of moon and stranger song, the anomalies had a name: reciprocity. "Show me," she said, and the word was both plea and command. Cale closed his eyes and placed both palms over a cup-shaped lichen pattern on a stone. The lichen glowed faintly. Where his fingers touched the rock, the surface shimmered and revealed a latticework no microscope had ever recorded, a pattern at the molecular scale folded into the chert as deliberately as a lock. Elena's heart did the ridiculous thing of beating like a drum in her throat. She had hoped for a trace. She had not dared to imagine the architecture of intent. The immediate thrill of discovery chased away the night's cold. Elena remembered the hours hunched in fluorescent light only to watch DNA sequences blur into the same coin of uncertainty. Here, in the field, the data was impossible and also irrefutably present. Stones that contained biosignatures under a skin of lichen, markers that matched the Wiltshire cluster's stubborn sequences. Her hands trembled, an inarticulate betrayal of the steady hands she kept for lab work. Cale opened his eyes and looked at her with something like gratitude. "You can read them," he said simply. They were interrupted by the low rumble of a vehicle engine miles away, a sound out of place in the hush. Cale's shoulders tightened as if a river had been stepped into. "They watch," he said. "They keep the ledger." Elena's euphoria cleaved into sharp edges. She had been aware of surveillance, the feeling of being home when her phone pinged with unfamiliar numbers, the odd little vans she'd seen outside the university that had parked and then vanished. She had reasoned that curiosity invited attention, a credible story invites containment. Now the attention had a name: the ledger keepers. The ones who ensured old bargains remained, and practice, the province of those who kept power. A headlamp bobbed high on the ridge, and then a second answered it. Metal sank into the dark. They were not alone in the field. 2 vehicles cut through the black, beams skimming over the grass. Cale rose slowly, his body catching the moonlight in a last luminous wheeze. "I cannot stay," he murmured, and there was an urgent tremor beneath his calm. "You are dangerous for us, Elena Ruiz, and yet you are precisely the one who could save what was negotiated." The lights came closer, and now shapes resolved. Men in dark clothing, radios clipped to their jackets, the way of people practiced in moving like a single thought. One figure stood apart, shorter, his shoulders narrower, his face an architecture of lines. He stepped forward, blinking into the moonlight, and for a cruel second, Elena thought she was being arrested by truth itself. He wore a suit that did not quite belong in the country dark, a passport and authority gathered into a single posture. He removed his gloves and extended a hand in human protocol and said, Dr. Ruiz, I'm Thomas Hale. Ministry. We need to talk. The name of the man who would become the thin, steady pressure opposing Cale landed like a stone in Elena's chest. She had imagined Thomas as a distant bureaucrat, a voice on a secure line that had delivered an instruction or two, requests for samples, offers of discreet cooperation. She had not imagined his face lighting under the moon, his expression unreadable. Here he was, all orders and belts and papers, an agent whose job it was to shepherd anomalies into boxes, safe for the state. But there was something else in the set of his jaw, in the way he watched the two of them together, an attentiveness that moved beyond the professional. He looked at Cale with something like caution, at Elena with something like calculation, and then, with a quick, private flicker, the look of a man who imagines himself capable of keeping terrible things in neat files. "Cale Rao?" Thomas said, and his tone made no apology for disbelief, only an efficient appraisal. "You're not authorized. Step away from the site." Cale's shoulders folded. Elena felt an ache like a hand cupping the fragile lamp of the night's possibility. "They will take him," she said, suddenly crystalline. "You'll take him into a black site, and they'll claim the treaty is a myth. The stones will be locked away, and the pattern will be studied until it is erased into policy." Thomas's eyes met hers, sharp and not unkind beneath their professional polish. "And you'll stay with him, Dr. Ruiz? You'll go rogue to protect an unknown emissary? There are laws. There are consequences." His voice softened in a way that was almost tender, and the double meaning landed between them. He spoke of legal consequences, but his words wrapped around the fear of tenderness, too. What if his obligations and his heart could be made to coincide? The dilemma thudded into Elena's ribs with the weight of everything she had ever wanted. Trust the being who had shown her in one impossible night the architecture of history and risk, the state she had sworn to as a citizen? Or trust the man with the clipped words and government pen, who offered the illusion of control and the protection of order, but had the capacity to lock away Cale's gentle truths? Between them stretched a canyon filled with layers of loyalty, professional, national, something younger and more animal that had lived in her chest when she first looked at Cale on her windowsill. She thought of her father, who had folded his hands in church and whispered that sometimes a person must choose what is right over what is safe. She thought of her mother, who had chosen order. Elena had spent her life learning to hold both choices inside herself and to measure them like microtomes got through bone. And here was the blade, cold and immediate. Do you save the emissary who could rewrite everything you study, or do you hand him to the ledger keepers to be logged away? Cale's hand brushed hers, a tiny electric contact, and she felt the code line up in her chest. Obligation, curiosity, a hungry ache of something that might become love. Thomas folded his arms and waited. The stones waited with the patience of granite. The night held its breath, full of the possibility of revelation and the cruelty of containment. Elena realized, with a clarity that hurt, that whatever choice she made in those few taut seconds would fracture her life into before and after. Elena felt the world shrink to the small expanse of grass between the stones and the three faces watching one another like rival constellations. The moon carved hard edges across Thomas's cheekbones. Cale's skin held the light as if it were an offered thing. Elena's breath came fast enough that the damp air turned it into steam. She felt absurdly, nakedly young. No longer the measured scientist who compartmentalized grief and discovery into neat folders, but a person with cold fingers and a wild, urgent wanting. "If you take him," she said at last, the words a blade she had not meant to unsheath so soon. "If you take him to a site where they strip him and interrogate him and run tests until there is nothing left but prints, then everything he showed me will be a theft. The treaty, the markers, those are not data to be owned. They are a memory. You can't keep memory in a vault." Thomas's expression tightened in 3 small movements, as if the world were a mechanism he had been trained to disassemble. "And you can keep it how? Let him, what? Walk free? Teach whoever he pleases? The implications for national security alone." He stopped, as if the rehearsed line for the ministry had failed him and a more personal cadence slipped through. "Elena, people die when unknown technologies are left unchecked.
People die when pacts are misinterpreted. The last words arrived soft, not an argument, but a confession. Cale's laugh, low, like a stone dropped into a deep pool, rippled into the night. You speak of people as if they are property to be guarded, Thomas Hale. We taught them. We bore risk. We gave. We left so you would keep what we had entrusted. Remembering is not theft. Hiding is. There it was, the hurt inside Cale's voice, a small fracture that let out the salt of loss. Elena thought of faces in the images he'd shared, the human hands, the children learning a new tool, a ceremony where seeds were placed like fragile promises into dirt. For every grain of wonder in what he'd shown her, there was also a ledger of unspoken grievances. Cale's people had made themselves vulnerable. The humans had been fallible. No wonder the memory had been hemmed away. You two speak in absolutes, Elena said, but the world I work in is always a tangle. Bones and seeds and stories. You can't put a line through a life and call it resolved. There are shades, ways to translate and keep people safe at once. That's what I do. Her voice came steadier than she felt, and she surprised herself with the stubbornness of it. The scientist in her refused to let this become a contest of loyalties without evidence, without protocols. Thomas's eyes narrowed. And you think you can be that translator, that you can be trusted with both this, he gestured to Cale, to the stones, and the country's safety? It was less a question than a dare. Elena could feel the old academic hunger rise up, the thirst to prove, to publish, to be the one who translated a civilization's memory into the language of humanity. But there was a counterweight, a memory of a tenure committee that had once frowned at her for maverick thinking, of funding panels that preferred conservative grants to wildfire ideas, of a marriage dissolved into polite texts. She had wanted to be the sort of scientist who could bridge worlds. This was the bridge in front of her. I can, she said, though the word felt precarious, but not alone. Thomas's jaw moved. For a moment his trained posture slipped, and there was an almost boyish impatience behind his diplomacy. You mean you want me to trust you with an alien emissary because you want to be close to him? There was truth in the accusation, and Elena did not flinch. The heat pooling in her chest when Cale's fingers had brushed hers was not entirely professional curiosity. It had the shape of something older and more dangerous. But there was dignity in naming the feeling. It refused to be dismissed as mere fancy. Maybe, she admitted, but feelings are not the only thing. I have the Wiltshire cluster. I have models, sequences, patterns.
I have methods that could allow us to study Cale's people without destroying them. We can do this ethically. And if your methods fail, Thomas countered, if they mislead us into accepting a thing that will cost lives. As much as you speak of ethics, there are mechanisms designed precisely for this: scientific oversight, military containment when necessary. Containment is not oversight, Cale said, his voice a thin, cold thing. Containment is erasure. They stared at one another until the headlights of the ministry vehicles cut across the field like a knife through fog. Men in dark uniforms moved with efficient silence to form a perimeter. Radios hissed, operators murmured. The atmosphere shifted from a fragile conversation to a standoff. Thomas stepped forward, close enough that Elena felt his heat in the night. I can offer you a compromise, he said. Temporary custody. You will come with us to the facility. You'll be allowed to observe. We'll run tests in controlled conditions. You'll sign off on protocols. He named the game, control wrapped in partnership. Elena's scientist's mind heard the strings attached, the secure facility likely outside of public oversight, the chance that Cale would be cut off from the stones and from any allies. The word temporary had always been a thin door that closed hard when you weren't looking. Still, the offer had a handhold. She had to weigh possibilities, not ideologies. Temporary custody? Cale repeated, and his tone carried an old anger that did not explode but sank like a chill. You would bind me with words you have written before I have told the whole of my people our story? That is not negotiation, Thomas Hale. That is insurance. And you would let anyone wander free? Thomas shot back. Elena, think rationally. If the existence of this treaty becomes known to every interest group and nation-state, the consequences might include learning how to stop a famine, Elena blurted. The words surprised her by their fervor. Cale's images of seeds preserved, of techniques offered that could steady fragile cultures, had not been abstract. They had been possibility, an ethical imperative.
If you wanted to protect people, you'd weigh what could be gained, not just what could be controlled. Thomas's face was a landscape of contradictory impulses. There was the bureaucrat who had written contingency plans and seen the damage of unintended technology transfer. There was a man who had clearly dedicated himself to protecting lives, perhaps out of a scarcity that hardened into caution. And then, if only in the subtlest of flickers, there was someone fighting against an ache he refused to name. He lowered his head as if to consult a file only he could read. "Fine," he said finally. "Temporary custody under a joint protocol. Restrictions on data release. You will be present. You will have access to him and to the site for verification. No public disclosure without clearance. No unauthorized samples."
Cale's laugh was brittle. "You set the leash and call it partnership." His hand brushed Elena's again, lighter now, an apology and a plea. "If you are truly our translator, Elena Ruiz, then you will make them see, make him see, that memories cannot be parceled away." Elena felt the terrible and exquisite weight of being chosen. Both men, so unlike each other, offered some version of salvation and some version of harm. One offered the wild, luminous unknown, Cale, whose whole being seemed to vibrate with a kind of sorrow and generosity. The other offered a structure that could protect millions, but also had the capacity to flatten wonder into jurisprudence. She thought of the stones behind them, enduring, patient, their secrets folded into layers of lichen and mineral. She wanted to be both merciful and pragmatic. She wanted to be heroic and also alive to the lives that might be put at risk by a naive trust. "All right," she said at last, and her voice did not tremble, though inside everything was raw. "We do it your way, Thomas. Temporary custody, joint protocols, I will be present for exchanges. But I will insist on one condition. The stones must be accessible for verification. Cale will not be isolated from the markers that hold his people's memory." Thomas's brow furrowed, but softened as he thought it over. "Access will be limited and supervised," he allowed. "Field visits on schedule. No direct contact with communities. We will ensure their safety." Cale studied her as if trying to read a map drawn in a language he half understood. "You will keep the covenant," he said finally, so low Elena could have missed it. "You will keep us in the world. And you must be transparent about what you are, Cale," Thomas said. "We need your cooperation for the protocols to work. No tricks." There was an old comic absurdity in the moment. Two beings, one shimmering like water, one clad in the human armor of bureaucracy, negotiating over a covenant as if it were a lease agreement. Elena imagined her colleagues hearing about this and either applauding their ethical courage or revoking her tenure. Yet in that absurdity, there was also a fragile consensus, a thread by which both risk and hope could be braided. "Agreed," Cale said. He extended his hand, the moonline of his fingers almost translucent. Thomas hesitated less than Elena expected, then reached out as if to complete a bargain he had once promised himself he would never make. Their hands met not in warmth, but in the precise grip of an accord. The touch was small and heavy, the sound of two worlds consenting to step into each other's orbit with negotiated straps. Elena watched the contact and felt an unexpected wave, jealousy as sharp and stupid as hunger, so human it surprised her. She wanted to reach between them, to be the bridge whose skin knew both light and ledger. Instead, she folded the emotion away, like lab notes filed in a top drawer, useful, but not for immediate display. There was work to do, protocols to draft, arguments to anticipate. There would be visits to secure facilities and cold fluorescent lights where everything felt smaller. There would be men who wanted power and others who wanted to be loved by authority. When Thomas spoke into his radio and summoned the van that would take them back through dew and fence and legalities, Cale knelt by the stone once more. "If you betray us," he whispered, perhaps to Elena, perhaps to the stones, "remember that we are not conquerors. We are keepers of possibility." Elena wanted to argue about betrayal as a two-way mirror, about the history of forgetting. But the night was moving toward a script they could not yet see the end of. She slipped her hand into Cale's for a moment, a small, human anchor, and he returned the grip, warm and steady. Then they walked together toward the waiting vehicle, Thomas between them in posture, but not in spirit.
The ministry men moved like black beetles in the grass. The stones watched with their ancient silence. As the vehicle rattled away from the moor, and the silhouette of Stonehenge receded into a shadowed memory, Elena leaned her forehead against the cool glass and felt the first small rupture, an internal tearing that felt like both hope and the cost of choosing. She had made a decision that opened doors and tightened cuffs. She had chosen to be a translator between scales of history and a mediator between a man made of moonlight and a man made of law. Inside the van, the air smelled of plastic and coffee. Thomas sat across from her with a tablet open, already drafting the terms he promised to honor. Cale reclined against the padded wall, silent, luminous. Elena watched him out of the corner of her eye and felt the ache grow into purpose. She would hold them both to their promises. She would protect what Cale called memory and ensure that Thomas's fears did not calcify into violence. She had promised to be the translator. She did not yet know what forms that translation would take. She did not yet know the betrayals the ledger keepers would commit, nor the small, luminous treasons Cale would beg of her. She did not know the choices Thomas would be forced to make when the full weight of the state's appetite revealed itself. She only knew that she had, in the briefest, most consequential instant, put herself between two forms of power. And between the edges of competence and desire, she felt, like a small green sprout under frost, the possibility that she could teach them both a new language, one that remembered how to give back. The van door closed with a pneumatic sigh that felt almost obscene after the whisper of stone. Inside, fluorescent strips hummed overhead like interrogation lights before the questions had even been asked. Men in dark uniforms moved with the smooth, practiced choreography of those who have rehearsed certainty into muscle memory.
At the far end of the compartment, under that unforgiving light, a metal case lay open. Its foam nest held instruments Elena would have loved to use for pure research, scanners and vials and cold, sterile trays, as if the apparatus of curiosity had been bought and then repurposed as the instruments of custody. Cale watched the equipment with a look that made Elena's chest ache. Curiosity threaded with the patient grief of someone who had watched good things translated into cages. He did not attempt to touch anything. When one of the technicians glanced his way, Cale bowed his head in a movement that read like apology and submission at once. Thomas sat rigid, hands folded around a tablet that had already become ledger and law. The interior of the van felt like an experiment in which she herself had been made the subject. "You will have access," Thomas repeated, as if the words could anchor reality. "I will ensure oversight. No unauthorized contact, Dr. Ruiz. You sign the protocol and you agree to the chain of custody." Elena read the first paragraph and felt the bureau speak fall into her like a wet sheet over flame. Everything legal, everything safe, everything meant to protect had its own syntax, its own slow violence. The form said that Cale was to be classified as an unidentified biological entity, that samples could be taken under ministry supervision, that the stone site would be monitored and sealed, that public disclosure would be restricted under national security. It did not say that temporary often became permanent, with small amendments filed in quiet offices, or that oversight sometimes meant that oversight replaced compassion. "I want amendments," she said. Her voice sounded smaller than she felt. Clause 10, no tissue excision without independent ethical review. Clause 12, no indefinite isolation. Clause 14, access to Stonehenge for verification. If you will not allow public disclosure, then you will allow independent oversight. Thomas's hands stilled on the tablet. For the first time that night, his expression shed its polished evenness. "Independent oversight is an ideal, Dr. Ruiz," he said. "Countries have different definitions of independent. You will not be left out of the process, but you must accept that some things cannot be public. Some things cannot be hidden either." Elena had the absurd impression she was arguing with the tide. He looked at her for a long moment and she read the calculation in his eyes. Risk, optics, legal exposure. Then he nodded once, a small concession that did not absolve the rest. "We will add the clauses you asked," he said. "No invasive samples without a review board. Scheduled supervised access to the stones. Temporary custody defined as 90 days, subject to review." "Signed," she said, and the pen felt like a bought betrayer in her trembling hand.
They arrived at the facility before dawn, an architectural nothing that tried not to be noticed, concrete and glass and the bureaucratic tempering of a building that preferred to be efficient rather than beautiful. Security checkpoints unfolded like the flaps of a hard, sensible insect. Each door required a key, each key required a voice print, each signature required another signature. Cale walked the halls with a stillness that made the guards uneasy. His mere presence in the corridor seemed to slow the air around him. Elena felt the old hunger to take measurements, to test, to catalog. Instead, she watched as technicians swabbed soil from the soles of Cale's boots, as men in white coats photographed the patterning on his skin, like an exhibit being cataloged for a museum of the uncanny. The facility smelled like bleach and ordered grief. Cale was placed in a room whose architecture had been chosen to discourage any scandal of beauty. Gray walls, a single bed bolted to the floor, one narrow window with blinds that reached only to the middle of the glass. There was a table with instruments locked in a clear case. Cameras sat in the corners. He sat on the bed, his knees pulled toward his chest as he had been outside Elena's window, and his hands found one another in the dim. Elena sat across from him for the first hour and then the second, and in the flat light of that room she tried to map what had been given and what had been taken. Cale's voice in the cheap plastic chair sounded thinned, attenuated by the bureaucracy around him. "They will try to reduce me to pattern," he said. "They will try to make us a problem they can solve with numbers." "They are trying to protect?" Elena began, and the sentence died on the hard floor between them. Protect who? The state? Its people? Or the fragile illusion of power? She had watched enough committees to know that protection often meant the consolidation of authority in the name of safety. And yet she also knew the rawness of fear in Thomas's eyes when he'd mentioned people dying. The world had corners of real danger where naive liberty damaged bodies. "You are not a question to be filed, Elena," Cale said, surprising her with the intensity in his eyes. "You are not the ledger. You are the one who has learned our grammar." Elena's throat tightened. "I signed," she said. The words felt like a summons she had not wanted to give. "I believed I could hold both the ledger and the memory." Cale's laugh was a small breaking of waves. "Belief is heavier than precedent," he said. "It breaks in places precedent never imagined." That afternoon, the first fracture arrived in a packet like a fall of leaves. A junior analyst, bright-eyed and over-enthusiastic, slipped a USB drive into Elena's hand with the furtive guilt of someone who has been given access to a locked library. "You should see this," he whispered. "It's from the archive. I thought you'd want to know." He ran off before she could ask how he'd obtained it.
Inside the drive were redacted memos and old field logs marked with dates Elena recognized from her own research, and with a name she had not expected to find: Project Canticle. Project Canticle was not the stuff of rumor. It was a ledger the state had kept in a different breast pocket. Decades of classified contact and contact management, liaison operations with unregistered personnel, surgical containment recommendations, the procurement of artifacts and humans for study. One entry, stamped and dated 32 years prior, listed a cooperative effort near Stonehenge, contact with non-terrestrial emissaries, and the subsequent retrieval of covenantal artifacts. The file used language designed to flatten wonder, extraction, study, containment protocols. But threaded through the bureaucratic cruelty were small, almost pleading notes, memos from field agents that read like eulogies for relationships that had been ended, not preserved. Elena's fingers shook as she scrolled. There was a photograph, grainy and half-glossed, of a circle of people around a slab of stone. The caption identified them as Liaison Team, 1978. A name in the photo margin made her stomach drop: Ana Ruiz, her mother. The dates matched a period when her grandmother had been silent and her father had worn a grief he refused to name. She had always thought that silence had been private mourning. Now it sat on the screen as a diplomatic file. She closed the laptop as if the room were a wound. Behind her, the facility hummed. She felt the air change, less a thing of comfort than a pressure shifting around an imminent storm. She thought of Thomas, of the careful restraint with which he'd negotiated, of the neat concession he'd allowed himself in the field. If Project Canticle was true, and the memo suggested that it was, then concealment had been institutional for decades. The possibility of a kind, careful relationship between species had been recorded and then hidden. The laughable phrase temporary custody had a history. It had been the rubric by which other beings and other people had been put away. When she confronted Thomas, he did not flinch. He watched her with the look of a man who had spent a career training himself to receive bad news with professional calm. "You shouldn't have that, Elena," he said simply. "Those documents are sealed for a reason." "Sealed for a reason," she echoed, the words catching like a rusted hinge. "Your file shows agreements, negotiations. My mother is in your files, Thomas. She was part of a liaison team. Why would you hide that? Why would you hide the past?" He was silent for a long minute, and then he reached out and placed a hand over hers in a motion that was almost a confession.
Because once something is public, you can't control the narrative, he said. The apology in his voice was small and insufficient. I thought containment would protect people in the long run. We kept records to avoid repeating past errors.
You kept records to keep power, Elena said. The room trembled with the force of her betrayal. You kept secrets to ensure you didn't have to feel… what? Compassion? Responsibility? The anger stole over her, hot and useless, but honest. My mother spent the last years of her life with holes in her speech and a tangle of stories she could not complete. You put her story in a vault and called it safety. Thomas's face crumpled for the first time, not in trained sorrow, but in the private ruin of a man who had realized his good intentions had been worse than useless. We were given terrible choices, he said. We believed we were choosing the least harmful path. And you call that choice? Elena's voice was keener now. You built a ledger to keep love from polluting your equations. He looked at her, and Elena saw the chastened thing in him. The bureaucracy had taught him to believe his orders were the moral center. The leak of Project Canticle did not only reveal state duplicity, it revealed Thomas as someone who had perhaps sought safety and found only the soft tyranny that safety can breed. In that moment, the man who had touched her hand under the moon and promised oversight became complicit in a history that had silenced her family. Cale listened to the exchange through the door, and when Elena returned to his room, she found him hollowed, the silence around him denser than the facility walls. "You have not witnessed everything we were," he said when she sat, the words bare as bone. "There were emissaries who familied themselves among you. There were children, there were pacts signed with names and blood and music, and there were ledger keepers who decided that memory was too dangerous." Elena's throat closed. Tears she had not expected soaked her collar. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought the silence had been personal." "Silence is someone's design," Cale said. "We left. We thought leaving would preserve you. We were wrong." That night, Elena lay awake on a thin cot across from his dormitory-style bed and felt the fracture between what she had imagined and what she now knew yawning wider. The institution of the state that Thomas represented had a tenderness behind it. He had been kind, even protective, but the institution itself had a different hunger, a hunger for control that fed on the erasure of messy, vulnerable bonds. The revelation of Project Canticle did not just complicate trust, it called into question everything Elena had relied on, her mother's reticence, her own decisions to work within systems, the idea that decisions meant for safety were always morally defensible. The fracture spread into bedrock. She could not be both the scientist who negotiated with the ministry and the daughter whose family had been cataloged and then buried. She thought of the hands in Cale's images, human hands receiving seeds, a covenant made, and felt the same sucker punch of grief she had felt seeing her mother's face on a government file.
She had made an agreement that would keep Cale in a box while the world slowly digested the implications. She had signed the papers. She had convinced herself with the thesis that oversight could be generous. Now the oversight looked like the first step toward erasure. The next morning, a radio transmission from an off-site lab arrived like a detonator. "Possible sample extraction scheduled," the message said. The words were clipped, bureaucratic, a line item made of cold possibility. Elena felt her throat close around a soundless cry. She demanded to see the schedule. The technicians produced confirmation. A midnight window, a team of 3, instruments sterilized, permission signed off by a man with a number instead of a conscience. She stormed into Thomas's office, her protest raw. "You promised," she said. "You promised me independent oversight." "I promised oversight," he said. His voice had the same flat diplomacy it had in the field. But behind it, under the armor, Elena noted the bad news that had been gnawing at him. His superiors had responded to unknown risk with a cold calculus. A decision was made at higher level. They want a sample. The argument is the same. Unknown technologies impose unknown risks. "You can prevent this," she said. "You can refuse." He studied her, and for the first time she saw the machinery between his ribs. Orders given, chains that did not break for sentiment. He might want to refuse, but refusal would cost his career, his contacts, perhaps even his freedom. The look that crossed his face was not that of a heartless man, but of a person whose hands were tied by a duty he had long accepted as moral. "If I refuse," he said, "they will replace me with someone who will not seek moderation." "You are asking me to choose between being complicit and being powerless," Elena said, the syllables sharp as a scalpel. "You made me complicit by asking me to sign the protocols knowing what Project Canticle contained." The argument turned into a slow, grinding disillusionment. In that exchange, crust cracked and then cratered. Thomas's eyes filled with something like apology, and then with the cold decision-making that had made him who he was. "I tried to bridge the ledger and the memory," he said, "but bridges are hard to keep when both sides doubt the other's intentions." Cale was taken that night while Elena argued with red tape and the slow machinery of conscience. The technicians came at 2 a.m. Their steps were too light for purpose. Elena had been left a single room to pace like a caged animal. When she finally heard the van doors, the hollow, institutional sound of them closing on a life she had promised to protect, something inside her split with the clean, terrible sound of a glass bell. She ran, her feet slapping on the tile in a frantic rhythm that made no sense. She reached the loading bay and found Thomas standing by the van, his face slack with a decision already made.
Cale sat in the back, the technician's hands gentle but firm on his wrists. He looked at Elena with an expression that was not surrender, but something akin to sorrow. "You did everything to stop them?" he asked. "I tried," she panted. "I signed, I argued, I tried." "You cannot be both translator and ledger keeper," Cale said gently. "One of those jobs requires sacrifice." Thomas opened his mouth to speak and then closed it, as if he suddenly realized he had nothing that would not sound like hypocrisy. He had, in the end, kept his oath to the state. He had not, if Elena's heart was to be believed, kept the oath to memory. The van's engine started, the technician secured a strap, and Cale was driven away. Elena reached for the door and it clicked a fraction too late. The van rolled out under the dawn and swallowed Cale in its dark, bureaucratic maw. Elena slid down against the concrete and let the first clean grief break through, hot, unplanned, and full of private blame. She had chosen to try to hold both worlds. She had failed. The stone songs that had made her stomach ache with recognition were now a blueprint confiscated into a file. Thomas's betrayal, or his fidelity to a system, left her raw. When she finally stood, wiping the rain, tears, or sky, she couldn't tell, from her face, she held the stolen USB like a small combustible thing. Project Canticle had removed the veneer. It had made the ledger bleed. Trust had become a thing to be measured and then found wanting. The fracture lines were obvious, between Cale and the state, between her and the institution she had tried to work within, between Thomas's duty and whatever tenderness had made him stay by her side that first night. She had signed to be the translator. The translation had failed the first test. But in the small, stubborn place beneath grief, something ignited. Anger thin and truthful as lightning. If institutions would not honor memory, she thought, then she would find a way to make those memories audible. If the stones would not speak in committee rooms, perhaps they would be heard elsewhere. The fracture that had opened in her chest was not only loss, it was also a new, dangerous clarity. She would have to break rules to keep the covenant. She would have to choose what kind of betrayer she would be next. Outside, the low gray day carried the chill of a world waking to the fact that promises had been made and promises had been broken. Elena straightened, the USB burning a small, cold promise in her palm. She would learn the cost of her next decision. She would learn whether betrayal could turn into rescue. But in this moment, the fragments lay around her. Trust, state, the luminous man whose hands still felt warm under her fingers, and she stood in the cracked, delicate space between them, willing the stones to remember for her, willing memory to be louder than the ledger. Elena did not wait for permission. The anger that had kindled in her chest hardened into a plan before grief could dull it, an ugly, brilliant thing made of all the small injustices that had landed on her like snow. She took the USB into a tiny room off the archive and fed the files into a burner. Project Canticle was not merely a ledger, it was leverage. Names, dates, chain of command decisions that could not be unsaid. If the state would hide memory, she would make the ledger loud enough that hiding would become impossible. She contacted the young analyst who had slipped her the drive. He met her in a side corridor with the nervous gait of someone who knew the law but not the courage to enforce it. "They'll come for you," he said. "You can't." "Then let them come," Elena replied.
I will not be the one who signs the death certificate for what Kael gave us. She wrote a single short message and pushed it into channels that would speak to a world hungrier for truth than the ministry would like to admit. To independent journals, to archival networks, to a few trusted colleagues outside the project's tentacles. The files flew like doves released from a too-tight cage. Within hours, there was a flicker of outrage rolling across forums, a small, dangerous hum that spread beyond control. The ministry's phones lit up with calls. The facility's director cursed through clenched teeth. Thomas's name, a man who had been trying, imperfectly, to cushion harm, was suddenly a hot seat in the press's eyes. He sat in his office and let the radio scream like a moral bell. When the call came from the van's remote lot, Kael was to be transferred for an invasive sample that night, Elena acted. She pulled on clothes dark as fur and cold as determination. She did not care anymore about the pen she had signed with. She only cared about the man whose hand had warmed hers under Stonehenge's stones. With the analyst's help, she hacked cameras, looped feeds, and inside 3 phone calls and a resigned, private conversation with a mid-level technician, she had weapons, distraction, and time. She found Thomas at the facility gate, face hollow with a man who had been stripped of illusion and left with the raw choices. "You leaked the files," he said. Not accusation, but statement. She looked at him and did not soften. "I did. And now you can stand with me or you can stand with them while they cut him open." For the first time since the moonlit field, his shoulders gave up something like a surrender. He had built a life on the premise that rules could keep people safe, but the files she had released had shown him the rot that rules often covered. "I can't stop everything in my role," he admitted, "but I can choose how I stop it." They moved like conspirators. Thomas used his clearance to reroute the transfer route, to stall the team with bureaucratic red tape he suddenly found a way to manufacture.
Elena used her knowledge of the facility, where the vents smelled of old printers, where the night shift drank bitter coffee, to slip past a guard on a smoke break. The plan was messy and human and full of the small, unforeseeable things that made heroism look less heroic and more true. A technician with a soft spot, a locked door that yielded to a forgotten master key Thomas kept in a pocket he had not known needed to be brave. When Elena reached the holding cell they had given Kael, she found him strapped to a bed as if he were an exhibit. He looked up with eyes that had not lost their luminous sorrow. "I thought you might come," he said, and the words were a benediction and a scolding in one. She cut the straps with a blade she had stolen from an equipment drawer. "We go now," she said. Her voice shook only once. The alarms began to riff like panic, blips of bureaucracy realizing it was losing control. Thomas's voice came over a radio, low and steady, giving false directions elsewhere, buying them seconds. He had made his choice. They fled through corridors that smelled of bleach and fear. Kael moved slower than before. Daytime confinement and sedation had leached a film of fatigue into his movements. When a blockade of guards formed like a wall of black, Thomas stepped forward and offered himself as a diversion. An official man in an honest uniform, with hands that would take responsibility for truth. Elena wanted to scream no, to take him with them, but Thomas's face had the expression of a man finally letting himself be accountable. "Go," he said. "Take the story. Make it mean something." His voice broke on the last word. Then he turned and held the line, a human shield of protocol. They ran like 2 fugitives and a man who was more than either. The night outside opened like relief. The van they'd taken to the facility was idling where they'd left it, but the technicians on its far side were distracted by Thomas's manufactured emergency. Kael nearly stumbled. Elena caught his arm and felt, under the shimmer of his skin, the real cost of his captivity. "There are things I cannot take with me," he murmured. "Ties that will burn if I leave." "Then don't leave," Elena said, half prayer, half command. She thought of the treaty, the stones, the bargain of seed and story. She thought of the tiny, terrible way love demanded risk. "Stay with me. We'll build the bridge together." Kael's hand closed over hers, and the touch was a map drawn across geography and species. He could leave. His people had ships and routes she could not understand. Exile would be safety for him, and death for the memory he embodied. But the brightness in his eyes dulled for a fraction, as if measuring what it meant to remain where ledger keepers could still claw. "I cannot stay without exposing you," he said. Fear wrinkled into his voice like tide lines. "If I remain, they will come for you." Elena's answer was an instant, reckless as the act that had first led her to a window. "Then we face them together." At that, Kael made his own sacrifice.
He opened his throat in a sound that was almost a song, and then a thin, cold thing that altered the facility's sensors, an interference that would protect their escape, but would also make him traceable. "This will draw them away from you," he said. "It will mark me." She watched him set the choice like a stone on a scale. He picked exile of certainty over safety of separation. He chose to be the beacon rather than the shadow. Elena felt his sacrifice like a hand at the base of her skull, steadying and opening something raw. "Then I'll be your harbor," she whispered. They drove until a horizon lightened and Thomas's diversion held. When they reached the moors, the sky was the washed pallor of early dawn. They pulled off near the old fence line, and Cale, still luminous, pressed his face to the cool stone of the moor and wept a soft, strange sound, grief for things he had not been able to save, and a luminous acceptance of what he had chosen to give. Elena leaned in and offered her shoulder. He took it like land taking rain. "You could leave," she said again, impossibly, clinging to the selfish whisper. "I could," he agreed, "but I choose here, for the memory, for you." When the first convoy of ministry vehicles rolled through the low dawn, they were searching a story already public. Project Canticle's files had been released widely enough to create accountability. Protests gathered like tides. Thomas, with a face of ruin and redemption, announced his resignation, and then a different truth in one speech he gave that would haunt him and heal others. He had chosen to stand against the ledger. It cost him rank and reputation, but bought him the fragile steadiness of a man who had finally answered for his past. In the weeks that followed, Cale was not exactly free. The world would not allow such an easy miracle, but he was no longer cataloged in a cold facility. Under pressure and public scrutiny, oversight boards formed with international observers. Elena sat on one.